Geography Podcast, an ongoing discussion about all things Jewy, with me, Rabbi Eitan Levy. This week, I'll be explaining the traditional Jewish perspective about sex. The second half of the show is going to feature an essay by a secret guest comparing conservative religious and secular attitudes towards sexuality. As always, you can find the notes to this show and other episodes, as well as links to subscribe at rabbieitan.com. That's RABBIEITAN.com. Sexuality is such a big issue that I'm not even going to try to get into the nitty-gritty of particular issues in this episode, but I am going to try to do an overview of the way sexuality is viewed in Jewish tradition, the laws and practices governing it, and how that affects our lives as committed Jews. I'm open to going more in depth on particular subjects in the future, though, so send me an email at eitan@rabbieitan.com or leave a comment about what you'd like to know more about if you're interested, and I'll try to address it in a future episode. Now let's jump in. So Jews living in the West, in predominantly Christian countries, which is most of you listening, tend to grow up thinking of the Christian perspective on sexuality as the religious perspective. That's actually even a broader issue, in my opinion, where a lot of people use the word religion, quote unquote, to talk about something when what they really mean is the particular religion I have been most exposed to, which is a particular brand of Christianity. But there are noticeable differences. I'm not a scholar of Christianity, so excuse me if I get that side of the equation wrong, but I understand that most Christians see sex as inherently sinful, a symptom of man's fallen nature, and Eve's punishment after eating from the apple. In Jewish tradition, in the Midrashim, that's the rabbinic commentaries on biblical stories, not only did sexuality exist in the Garden of Eden before this sin, but Adam and Eve made love and had children before then. The punishment of the sin was that they would now have to work hard. Adam would work the land and Eve would have pain in childbirth. But whereas much of early Christianity took a somewhat negative view of sexuality, advocating for a monastic lifestyle as ideal, a way to contemplate God without interruption from the troubles of family and children, Judaism always saw sexuality as essentially a positive force when kept in the proper boundaries. In fact, in Jewish belief, sexuality within the sanctifying confines of marriage can be one of the holiest acts we ever do, because we are emulating God by creating life. There's a common saying in Hebrew that a child is created with three partners, the mother, the father, and God. And if God is ultimate goodness, then imitating him, that is, imitatio Dei, is the ultimate good we can do in this world. So the general attitude about sex in Judaism is very positive. But when you think about Jewish sexuality today, you probably think about restrictions, because the general culture is so permissive by comparison. So let's talk about these restrictions, what they are, why they're in place, and how they fit into the sex-positive attitude I'm talking about. Before I go on, I want to clarify something about what I mean when I say sex-positive. I clearly don't mean the same thing here as modern secular feminist writers. That's a different discourse. It does not mean that everybody has or should have complete agency to have as much sex however they want with whomever they want. But having restrictions on a behavior doesn't mean we're negative about it. After all, we have tons of rules about food, but would anybody ever accuse Judaism of being negative about food? Don't be ridiculous, right? So what are the rules governing Jewish sexuality? Broadly speaking, there are two issues. One about the marriage bond, the situation in which two people are allowed to be together, and within the marriage, what times they're allowed to be together. Sex before marriage is forbidden in Judaism, as in most traditional cultures and religions. There are arguments about what level of authority this prohibition is, rabbinic, from the Torah itself. However, that might be different for men and women, and all sorts of questions around it. But practically speaking, it's forbidden. That's pretty much agreed by everybody. Of course, in a world before birth control, the practical reasons for this were completely obvious to everybody. If a woman was going to risk getting pregnant, she would want to make sure she would have the father there to help her raise the child. But even though in the modern world, sex doesn't necessarily lead to children, Judaism still sees this as the primary purpose of that act. In fact, some forms of birth control are forbidden by Jewish law and others are still applied sparingly. This is because of the first positive commandment given in the Bible, to be fruitful and multiply. It's very important in Judaism, so we still want to create a culture where people are family-oriented, where sexuality is kept within a context of marriage, which lends itself to creating a home and, at least potentially, having children and raising them. The timing issue that I mentioned is called nida. It's a status in Jewish law that a Jewish woman is in from the time her period starts until she goes, about 12 days later, to immerse in the mikveh, a ritual bath. During this time, a husband and wife are not allowed to have intercourse. Being together at this time is considered on the highest level of transgression, which carries the penalty of karet. That means being cut off spiritually from the Jewish people and from God. Since sexuality is such a powerful force, its misuse can be as terrible a force of destruction as its proper use can be a tool for goodness and creation. But human sexuality is slippery. We have mixed feelings about things. We can easily be overcome by lust and make bad decisions and sort of slip into things that we didn't intend to, more easily than in most serious areas of our lives. To prevent that, Jewish law, halacha, has a series of fences to prevent us from stumbling over the edge. For example, boys and girls, certainly once they reach puberty and in some places well before that, generally are more or less socially segregated. Separate schools, boys, girls schools, etc. Casual friendships between young men and young women are not generally encouraged and in some communities even completely forbidden. Any man and woman, beside immediate family, are not allowed to touch at all unless they're married and it's the time of the month when they are allowed to be together. The pull of attraction between a husband and wife in this time is seen as so strong that they aren't even supposed to pass objects directly to one another or eat off each other's plates at the table or other affectionate actions like that that are part of the normal daily life of any married couple. I remember seeing a clip going around on YouTube of some woman's daytime show in the US. I think the host was Tyra Banks. I could be mistaken. They were talking about periods, women's menstrual periods, and different customs different women had around them from different cultures. A Hasidic woman in the audience stood and explained that during the menstrual period, she and her husband aren't allowed to be together. The host asked, but what if you just kind of, make a mistake and it happens? The woman responded that they are kept far away from it in a way that's not really possible. There is no oops. And she's right. You won't just lose it from making out and slip into bed if you follow the rules around it. You won't get to that point where you're touching, where you're affectionate, where one thing leads to another, because you don't have the one thing. There are too many steps, too many taboos and points to stop yourself along the way before it gets to that. And that's the general idea about these rules in the society, that it's keeping people far enough away from this very strong, natural, powerful urge that we have so that we can approach it in a sanctified way and not just as an outlet for our lust. This issue of not touching is one aspect that religious Jews often come up against some issues with in dealing with non-religious Jews or non-Jews. The rule where men and women don't touch is called shmirat negiah, or guarding of touch. If you've ever tried to hug or shake hands with an Orthodox Jewish person of the opposite sex and had them pull away awkwardly, well, this is why. It's not about you personally, and it certainly isn't about seeing the other sex as bad or dirty. I've had several people, women be offended by this, and it doesn't make any sense. You shouldn't be offended because a woman would do the same thing towards a man. It's not one directional. It goes in both directions. It's about maintaining your own boundaries and your own and control over your own sexuality. Many rabbis hold that shaking hands is not affectionate, and so they allow it. Others don't. So what scrupulously observant Jews do follows a spectrum. Personally, I try to avoid it, except when I think it will cause offense. Then I rely on the lenient opinions. There's so much more. I could talk about this for an hour, but I don't want to bore you to death. So what I would like to do is end this chat now, and I'm considering doing a future episode about the Jewish attitude towards homosexuality and how we deal with that in the modern world. If you have any other subjects that you'd like to hear about what's been covered here or about any other subject, let me know if you'd like to hear that. And let me know what else I touched on here that you'd like to know more about or any other subject. And feel free to just ask me questions directly by email. And now that we've gone through a sort of rabbinic overview of Jewish sexuality, I want to introduce our first guest on the Jewish Geography podcast. Daniela Levy is a women's self-defense instructor, translator, and is currently training to be a premarital counselor for women in Israel. She also happens to be my wife and the mother of my children, as well as one of the smartest and most articulate people I know. She blogs at letterstojosep.com, which is written in the form of letters to a real-life, non-Jewish friend of hers from Catalonia. About 8 years ago, she and Josep had a conversation about Jewish religious attitudes towards sexuality versus secular European attitudes. This is her response to him. You can read the full version with references at letterstojosep.com. That's Josep spelled Josep, no H at the end. Now here's Daniela.
There's more than enough material out there about what religious people can sometimes get wrong about sex. Inadequate sexual education, premarital counseling, shame, etc. I'm sure you've heard all that before, and these are things we are working on as a society, and I think there has been a lot of progress. But here are some things I have learned about what religious people get right about sex. Number 1. Modern society's insistence on the separation between sex and love can be very damaging for monogamous relationships. This is really fundamental to understanding our original disagreement. The mainstream secular conception is that sex is, and I think you even made this comparison, like a sport, something you do for pleasure with other consenting adults that you can get better at the more experience you have, and the way to enjoy it the most is to have a variety of different and exciting experiences. Well, no freaking wonder secular society views marital sex as a drag. What's new and exciting about it? I have a few problems with this view. One is that it's intellectually inconsistent. You can't argue on the one hand that sex is completely separate from love and then turn around and say that remaining faithful to one partner is a fundamental principle of a happy monogamous relationship. It makes no sense. If you believe that remaining sexually faithful to one partner is an elementary criterion for being in a faithful romantic relationship, that means that sex and romantic love must be connected to each other. If they weren't, why would you care who your partner slept with? It's her body. She can do what she wants with it. It has nothing to do with you. Unless it does. Or unless you're one of those polyamory or open marriage people, but let's not even go there. The vast majority of humanity intuitively considers sleeping with someone other than your life partner infidelity. The traditional conception of sex championed by the major faiths is that it's less like a sport and more like, say, figure skating. Sure, you can be a fine figure skater, but if you're skating with a partner who doesn't know your routine and whom you don't trust, things are bound to get awkward. The longer you skate together, the more you learn each other's strengths and weaknesses, and the better you skate together. The analogy isn't perfect, though, because sex is a lot less about learned skill or inborn talent and a lot more about effective communication. We'll elaborate more on that later. Number 2. The entire idea of sexual compatibility is based on a very short-sighted view of sexual relationships. This is one of your main arguments in favor of premarital sex, and you are not alone in this argument. There is a common idea that it is necessary to try it out with a potential partner before getting married to make sure you are compatible. And when you're a young secular person who hasn't been involved in a real long-term relationship, of course the idea makes sense. If you're picking up a girl at the bar and heading to a hotel room, all you've got there is two strangers with no basis for knowing what the other person prefers and no relationship of trust and communication to work it out. What if she likes X, Y, and Z and you don't? Bummer. Well, that didn't go well. Awkward. But in a long-term monogamous relationship, these things are completely irrelevant. Why? 2 reasons. First of all, you have your entire lives to figure it out. When you're with a partner who you trust and feel totally comfortable with, you can make compromises, you can try different things, you can experiment, you can learn together, you can make mistakes, you can laugh. You can have an awkward and disappointing experience and then try again tomorrow. It's a whole different paradigm, and it's the very paradigm that makes marriages work. Commitment to sticking it out even when things are messy and difficult and communicating effectively throughout are essential to a healthy relationship of any kind. Second of all, people change. Their desires, needs, and preferences change over time. We get older, our priorities change, our schedules change, our physiology and hormones change, and let's not even talk about pregnancy and babies, right? My point is, a couple's first sexual experience is actually a pretty terrible sample by which to measure the success or lack thereof of their potential sex life. The question of what if he likes X and I like Y is far less important than the question of, do I feel comfortable enough with him to discuss what I like and don't like? Does he feel comfortable enough with me to do the same? Are we open to listening to each other and learning about each other's needs and adapting to each other as we grow? That is real compatibility, good communication, and that is something that can be tested, built, and nourished without ever getting in bed. Sex is not a performance that either succeeds or fails. It's a journey you embark on together, and it gets better and better with time. Which brings us to the next point. Number 3. Studies show that statistically, married people are more satisfied with their sex lives, and the more religious they are, the more satisfied they are. Yes, you heard that right. A survey by the Center for Sexual Health Promotion at Indiana University found that married couples have more frequent and more satisfying sex than their unmarried counterparts. A study by the University of Chicago found that married religious Christian women had much more satisfying sex lives than their non-religious counterparts. Well, that kind of flies in the face of the sexually suppressed puritanical Christian stereotype, doesn't it? It is a known fact that both divorce rates and infidelity rates are lower in religious communities. Aha, says the modern secular person, but that's probably because divorce is taboo in those communities and more people are stuck in loveless marriages. Are they? The data tells a different story, at least when it comes to Jews. A survey by the Orthodox Union found that Orthodox Jews are significantly happier in their marriages than the general population. And there have been other studies, University of Georgia, University of Toronto, and a report by a professor at Oxford, that showed that Jews had happier marriages than members of other faiths. But what if it's just ignorance is bliss, protests the modern secular person, that they don't know what's out there and what could be better? Right back at ya. What if it's people who engage in casual sex who don't know what could be better? What if they are missing an entire dimension to sex that makes it so much more than a mere pleasurable physical experience? To me, it seems that modern secularism conceives of the quest for a good sex life in the same way we conceive of the quest for, like, the tastiest strawberry in the batch. Gotta try them all before you can judge what is the best, right? But hello, we're not talking about an experience with a strawberry. We're talking about an experience with a person. An experience that can be a powerful one of utmost connection and love. It's the difference between reading Shakespeare as a teenager and reading Shakespeare after earning a PhD in literature. An experience of entirely different depth that you can't even comprehend before you get there. Even if you dismiss all that and want to argue that we're settling for an only mildly tasty strawberry, wouldn't you rather be the guy who is totally happy with his strawberry than the guy constantly thinking about the tastier strawberries that might be out there? Okay, maybe let's lay off the strawberry analogy. Number 4, if you successfully build your relationship on effective communication and trust, when you wait until marriage, you're at a significant advantage for starting a positive long-term sexual relationship. In the 7.5 years I've been married, and given my interest in becoming a madrichat kala, a bridal counselor, I've come in contact with a few programs and books geared towards the general public about how to improve one's sex life. And after that conversation with you, I was actually kind of surprised and fairly self-satisfied to discover that, for the most part, they don't focus on physical technique. They focus on how to make a meaningful connection, to communicate well, to understand your partner's needs and desires, to flow with your partner, to listen to your partner. Sure, there are some technical details that are important and helpful, but let's just say it ain't rocket science, and there's plenty of very easily accessible material addressing it. Now, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of religious couples who do not learn how to communicate well before marriage, and there are plenty of religious marriages that start out badly in this area. But for the most part, it's not because they don't know what they're doing, it's because they don't know how to listen and communicate with each other. By the way, this is all putting aside various disorders and stuff that may be affected by an overly restrictive or harshly negative view of sex in the community. That's also an important conversation, but it's a different one. But you know what's the most effective way to learn to listen and communicate with each other? Listening and communicating in a setting that does not involve the pressure, tension, and vulnerability of a first sexual encounter. You asked me once how it's possible to date somebody without ever touching him. I laughed. You talk? I suggested. You spend time together? I later explained that building a relationship without touching each other gives you the opportunity to lay the foundations of your relationship by learning how to communicate through other means first. I know that a lot of people think, as you do, that casual touch means nothing. Science, however, begs to differ. Your body releases certain hormones in response to touch, which can influence how you think about the person you are touching. There was a study that showed that people gave much bigger tips to waiters who touched them lightly on the arm versus waiters with whom they had no physical contact. Touch is more powerful than you think, and it can affect your judgment, especially when there is sexual attraction involved. I think what you were really asking me, though, was how do you express romantic affection for somebody if you can't hug or kiss him or her? Good question, Josep, and that's exactly my point. Everyone should know how to communicate love through means other than touch. Touch is a most powerful tool for communication, but other kinds of communication are just as important, and they tend to get neglected when touch is on the table. So yes, dating without touch was hard. It was very hard. But both Eitan and I learned a lot from it. The communication skills we mastered during that period have served us very well in our marriage, and the magic of that first touch was definitely worth the wait. Number 5. A little self-control ain't never done hurt nobody. This is a major beef I have with the common attitudes of mainstream society. They tend to equate self-control with suppression. The very idea of waiting until marriage is just ridiculous in modern culture, puritanical. Either you're a crazy religious person or you're an old-fashioned prude. The thing is, there's a middle ground between an unhealthily negative and oppressive attitude towards sex and the kind of openness that characterizes modern culture. You know why this attitude is really strange to me? Take eating, for example. Fad diets are all the rage these days. The media is full of information and misinformation about which types of food to eat and which to avoid. This can be taken to quite an extreme. The language people use to describe eating habits, like clean eating and sinful food and whatever diet legal, sometimes speaks in terms of morality. People talk about eating unhealthy food as though it is some kind of moral failing. But even without that extreme, there is this totally accepted idea that for the sake of your long-term physical health, you must exercise self-control. Why is this a totally accepted idea about long-term physical health, but not about long-term sexual health? Why does nobody tell young people about the damaging effects of overexposure to pornography, for example? Why does nobody tell them that people who engage in casual sex tend to be more anxious and depressed, according to a study, than their monogamous peers? With all this focus on educating teens about STDs and birth control and consent, no one dares to raise the question whether the complete lack of boundaries among young people could be damaging to them in some way. There has been a lot of awareness raised in recent years about consent and exactly what it means and how to be sure there is consent, etc. Don't get me wrong, it's a very important conversation, but the entire thing is completely bizarre to me because in communities like mine, that distinction is hardly necessary. Barring situations of abuse, it is abundantly clear to a religious man when it is okay to have sex with a woman and when it isn't. He doesn't have to sit through a sexual consent class in college to figure this out. Even within a marriage, halacha is very explicit about consent. A man is not allowed to have sex with his wife if she is drunk, sleeping, angry at him, or otherwise disinclined. These ideas have been incorporated in Jewish law in black and white for hundreds of years. Very clear boundaries make these situations so much easier to navigate. In summary, I'm not saying it's impossible to have a healthy marriage or long-term relationship if you engage in the kind of sexual behaviors that are considered normal in secular culture. Of course not. What I'm saying is, don't pity us religious people for our strict boundaries around sexuality. Those very boundaries might be what make us statistically more likely to have happier marriages, and the sexual freedom that characterizes modern culture might actually work against you in the long run. Food for thought.
Welcome to Happy Hour, where we bring you something to be happy about, something uplifting, without pulling any punches or resorting to cat videos. Last night, I had this horrible dream. I won't go into details, both because it feels too raw and personal still, and also because it would be boring. But in the end, one of my children died from an accident, and that's when I woke up, heart pounding, with another one of my kids, the 3-year-old, snuggled up against me in bed. I put him back in bed and couldn't get back to sleep for hours. I saw a sweet email from my mother, and I felt loved. I went and sat in my kids' room for a bit and watched them sleeping. I thought about how lucky I am and how much I have that many other people don't. The warmth of a baby cuddle, the love of my parents, my wife, a roof over my head. It It's easy to get caught up in the news, in how terrible things are happening all around the world. But for most of us, and indeed for most of the people in the world, even those who are truly suffering from poverty and oppression, these warm human interactions, the love of family, the joy in success, and life itself goes on. The world is full of life and full of love and full of goodness. When those little bunches of love and goodness bump into each other, we have conflicts. Some of those conflicts are avoidable and others are not. But one doesn't negate the other. The existence of both continues at the same time. Most of us don't have the ability to affect the big political realities beyond a vote every few years and posting rants on Facebook, which of course we all know doesn't do any good, but we do it anyway. But we do have the power to be patient with a struggling coworker. We have the power to give an extra long hug to our kids in the morning, to care about those close to us and help them feel loved and appreciated. For me, having faith means that I believe that if I try my best in the areas where I actually have control, that's enough. God is not asking me personally to stop ISIS, but he does seem to want to test my patience, my kindness, my ability to express love, and my creativity on a daily basis. These are struggles we all have, and struggles in which we all have a chance at success. So, no matter what's going on in the world far away, today go out and be somebody's hero. It'll make everything better. That's all for this episode of Jewish Geography. If you like what you're hearing, please head over to rabbiaton.com and go to the podcast page. You'll find links to subscribe there on iTunes or Android or by RSS feed, as well as the show notes. And if you have a minute and want to do something to support the show, I'd really appreciate it. You can go over to iTunes and leave a review. Just search for Jewish Geography. I'll be back next week with a brand new episode. In the meantime, have a wonderful week, a restful weekend, and may you all be blessed, may we all be blessed, with a week of only good news and peace.